Please join me in welcoming Andrew and Jamie.
Well, first of all, thank you for a very warm welcome. Lovely to be here. Although I'm British, I live in Pasadena, which is only, 2 hours, 2 hours down the way. So a big shout out to all my friends in Pasadena who are watching this on the live stream today. So Diana, well, I'd been writing about the royal family for a number of years, and I got to know some of Diana's friends, notably a chap called James Colthurst. James was a surgeon and a doctor, and he was an old Etonian. He was a good friend of Diana's, and we became good friends. And what I didn't realise, I was following Diana around the world, to America, to Australia, to New Zealand. I didn't realise that she was living a life that was deeply unhappy, and that her husband was effectively living with another man's wife, Camilla Parker Bowles. Never heard of her at the time. Anyway,
wow.
I was writing books. I wanted to write a biography of Diana. I'd written a book called Diana's Diary, which was a kind of a frothy lifestyle book. And she quite liked it. And at some point in 1991, she said to James, would he like an interview? Now, back in 1991, Diana was the most famous person on the planet and the most enigmatic. And so, I thought, well, she's going to give me an interview about, I don't know, her charity work and her humanitarian mission. And it wasn't anything like that at all. I remember James summoned me to a working man's cafe in North London, in a place called Ruislip. I sat down, put on these headphones, and he turned on his tape recorder, and he taped her in her apartments in Kensington Palace. And this breathless voice came out from the tape recording. It was almost like a prisoner trying to get the message out from. She had 50 minutes to get the message out. I heard about this woman called Camilla. Never heard of her. Heard about this condition called bulimia. Never heard of it. Heard about the fact that she cut herself. She'd made these half-hearted suicide attempts. I walked out of that place, out of that cafe, like I'd entered a parallel universe. And it's do you remember that scene from All the President's Men, where the Bob Woodward character is in an underground car park, and he thinks he's been watched, and Deep Throat goes off, and then he starts running, and he runs through the empty streets of Washington. I felt exactly the same way when I heard that tape recording. When I went to the subway, I stood well back from the platform edge, because it's very difficult 25 years later to kind of convey that intense shock. Remember, I'd been following this girl around the world. I was as near to her most days as this lady here. And you realize you knew nothing. You knew nothing. And for the next year or so, year and a half, 2 years, we worked on this book together. And I was not just writing the book with her cooperation, asking her questions and so on, but also helping her to write speeches, advising her on how to deal with the media. It was almost like being a shadow court, being a kind of like a private secretary. It was an extraordinary year of living dangerously, but also living, in the most historic period of my life.
And did you come away feeling sorry for her and what did you think of her?
Oh, I was absolutely smitten. I thought she was great. I mean, she, and what we used to do, and it's very funny, when I was on a royal tour, say we went to Czechoslovakia, she'd in the sea of faces, she'd find me, and she'd be looking, and then she'd look back, and then she'd stare at me, and she'd make some kind of gesture that was like, everything good, So I didn't feel sorry for her. I felt sorry for the position she was in, because it was, at that time, it seemed hopeless, because here she was, the future queen, living the life that was very lonely, where she, as she used to say to me, she'd wake up first thing in the morning, and she'd feel fine. She'd read the newspapers, and then feel lower, as she said, than a cockroach in Bulgaria. So, so she, and yet she was tough. She was, she had that aristocratic toughness about her. For anybody who's been divorced, that conversation where you say, well, we should, call it a day, is a very difficult one. But just imagine for her, as the Princess of Wales, talking to the Prince of Wales about, I don't want to be with you anymore, I want a divorce. It showed a remarkable courage that she had, and also, in cooperating with me, a remarkable recklessness. She didn't know me that well. We'd met on royal tours, and we'd stood in cocktail parties, and she'd spoken to me, and the conversation was always light, bright, and trite. It was usually about my ties. I'm not wearing a tie today, but they were usually quite flashy in those days. Think back to the 1980s and 90s. But I didn't know. I wouldn't have called her a great friend, and yet here she was. Articulating her innermost thoughts, her innermost demons, and at any moment I could have said, well, it was all about Diana. But my publisher and we decided to give her what's called deniability. I would just deny that she had anything to do with the book. And if she was alive today and I was talking to you, I'd be saying, no, she had nothing to do with the book. No. Her friends and family did, but Diana didn't. So we gave her that kind of cover story. And then so when the book came out, I was the one who was as it were, the flag catcher.
And so did she speak to you, continue after the book came out? Because the book was an international sensation.
Oh yeah, we were in constant contact. I mean, it was like she would be on the phone to James Coulthurst, who was the intermediary, and I'd be, she'd be on the phone to, you can be James,
yes.
You're Jamie, you can
James.
be James, and she'd be on the phone to James, and I'd be sitting here, and so it would be 3 or 4 times a day for 40 minutes at a time. And so it was, as I say, it wasn't just about doing a book, it was also about trying to organise her life, trying to help her make sense of her life, because it's not something you can do on your own. It was a tremendous upheaval, not just for herself, but for her children, for the royal family.
So would you say, Andrew, are you a monarchist?
I certainly am, yeah. I think the royal family is a great asset to Britain. Funnily enough, when Diana was, when she was married in 1981, I was so sick of I wasn't doing anything about the royals. I wanted to be a political journalist. I wanted to be, somebody who covered politics from Westminster. So I went on a squash course in playing squash rackets for a week, just to get away from all the nonsense about the royal family and the wedding. And then within 6 months, I found myself on a Pan Am flight, going to the island of Mustique, chasing a chap called Prince Andrew and a young lady called Koo Stark.
we remember that.
who had gone to this island in the Caribbean. Some of you may know it. It's a private island under the assumed married name of Mr. and Mrs. Cambridge. And then for the next week, myself and a whole horde of journalists from around the world, because I'll take you back to 1983. 82. He was the Falklands War hero who'd come down the deck with a rose between his teeth, and he'd been greeted by the Queen and Prince Philip, and he was the world's most glamorous bachelor now that Prince Charles was married. And here he is going off with Catherine Stark, an American actress, and everybody thought, wow, this is sensational.
She wasn't quite an actress, was she?
Well, I have to say, this is where labels stick. She was called a soft porn actress. I mean, if you've ever seen those films, and I've seen them several times,
do go on.
They are the most tepid. You could get it in an advert these days. So, I'm afraid. As Prince Harry said about his meeting with Meghan Markle, the stars were aligned. Well, for Prince Andrew and Koo Stark, the stars were definitely not aligned. She happened to be in the wrong time with the wrong. She'd done the wrong job, and who knows? In today's world, she would have been a princess.
And Andrew, so when Diana dies in '97, your book is re-released.
Yep.
And how many copies has this book sold worldwide today?
A couple.
A
Yeah.
couple.
About 10 million. I
10 million.
I think it's the best-selling royal book of all time.
10 million copies.
Like
Is that amazing? All right.
Yeah.
All right, we have a lot to cover here, Andrew. Is your insight into Prince Charles clouded by Diana's revelations?
Well, of course. I mean, I'd met Prince Charles on numerous occasions,
Yes.
and he always struck me as being a very charming, witty, personal individual, and so it was very difficult intellectually and emotionally to equate the man that Diana was describing to the person that I'd met. And my publisher, when I first, who's an American guy from Pennsylvania, he said to me, "Look, if Diana's so unhappy, how come she's always smiling?" And he was a good point. And with Prince Charles, he's a very charming individual.
Yes.
And so you wonder, is she exaggerating a little bit?
So Andrew, I was at Buckingham Palace
Yeah.
last year at the Prince of Wales Foundation dinner. My daughter's on the board said, "You must meet this American lady who manages the prince's money, William and Harry's money." And I met this little lady who was like the size of a refrigerator. And she was quite a character, gave me a tour of the private areas of the palace. And I understand that she left $30 million in trust for each of the sons, or it's worth $30 million today when they turn 30.
Depends what they've invested in.
Yes, well, she did well. But they.
I think she started off with £17 million.
Pounds.
The mathematicians
Right.
amongst you can work out the dollar rate.
So when Harry and William inherit the money, do they also get a civil list? And explain to the audience, civil list, and also do they get income from any other royal monies that they're getting?
No, the Prince of Wales, Prince Charles, gets his money from what's called the Duchy of Cornwall.
Which is enormous, isn't it?
Which is a huge area of farmland and light industry in the west of England. Harry and William have got their own money, and they don't take any money from the civil list. So the civil list is often misunderstood. Back in the 18th century, the king.
19th.
No, hang on. The 18th century.
The regent.
The king was responsible for the army,
Yes.
the diplomatic service, the upkeep of the royal castles and the royal buildings, and in exchange for the nation taking that on, the government decided to give the royal family a civil list, an amount of money, so that they didn't have to pay all that out and administer that. So essentially, the royal family are given an amount of money which is divided up: the Queen, Prince Philip, and Princess Anne, and so on, and that keeps pays for their upkeep.
Well, I always heard it was the Prince Regent that became George IV, who spent the country and spent his fortune, and then had to basically negotiate the Crown Estates.
Well, exactly. They're also always in debt.
Explain the Crown Estates. That's interesting.
So, essentially, the royal family have had a pretty good bargain out of it. The army and the rest of it is paid for by the nation.
So the Crown Estates are some of the great holdings in England, and they generate income which the Queen's entitled to a certain percentage. That's more or less what the civil list is based on, her income. So today we're here to talk about two new books, and so everyone's got a copy of Wallis and a copy of Meghan. And we'll start with first of all, I love both of these books, but Andrew, I have to say, I didn't love Wallis. By the time the book ends, or I just didn't like her. So, did you like Wallis?
A couple of American ambassadors said that separately and independently said that she was brittle and somewhat harder than a diamond. So to say that she was tough was an understatement. But I do think that she's not had a very good rap, because She was blamed for the abdication.
Right.
And it hadn't, and really, when you go through these vital few days in 1936, when in December, when the king, Edward VIII, is deciding to leave his throne for the woman that he loves, Wallis Simpson, she's in the south of France on a phone line saying to him, do not abdicate. And the phone lines are not like the phone lines today. She'd be cut off all the time. And she was saying at that time, I'll be painted as the blackest woman in history. And I think she is. She is one of the, and yet the irony is, the decision to abdicate wasn't hers. She wanted him to stay on. Guess what she wanted to be? Queen. There you are, you see. She didn't want to spend the life roaming around or going from,
House parties.
one house party to a yacht to a hotel suite at the Waldorf. She wanted the top job. She wanted to be queen, and she never admitted that publicly, but that's what privately she aspired towards. And she, nor quite frankly, was she that keen on the king. I mean, when he called her and said, darling, I've abdicated, I've done it all for you, her response was, you goddamn fool. I mean, yes.
So was she having affairs in London during the time that she was also his mistress?
Well,
Excuse me, can I hold up this? The 17 carnations.
Yeah, this is not...
This is soon to be made into a movie. Andrew is writing this movie now.
Like now, I'm on scene 7.
Join the California screenwriters.
So she was being followed by... There was such concern in the establishment, the British establishment. Who was this woman? She's American. Her husband is some shipping agent, lowly shipping agent. She's been married before. What do we know about her? Is she trying to blackmail the prince? This is before the prince became Edward VIII. So his father, George V, called in the Home Secretary, called in the Prime Minister, and they decided to have them followed. And so for 18 months, the Simpsons were being followed around London. And one of the first reports was that the Superintendent Canning, who was their Scotland Yard spy, said that the prince was going around lots of antique shops with Wallis, and she called him darling, which showed an intimacy. That Ernest Simpson, the husband, was a man of the bounder sort who wanted to be a baron. But worst of all, there was a man called Guy Trundle who called himself a used car salesman, who was accepting gifts from Wallis, and was apparently a rather good dancer. So he said so himself. So, and also we have the Nazi element in this.
Please.
She was seen as a Nazi spy by some elements in the establishment, and she was seen that it was said that she was having an affair with Joachim von Ribbentrop, who was then the German foreign envoy, Hitler's envoy. And apparently every time they had conjugal relations, he gave her a carnation. And he eventually got to 17. Not in the same day, but give him a week or he was very German.
Andrew, that's great. So Andrew, tell us about we've all watched The Crown. Tell us about the episode dealing with the file that the British Foreign Service discovers, the German file. Was that true that the king, that the Duke of Windsor really thought he might be reinstated?
Oh, absolutely. He thought that he was, that they could put him, the Germans might put him back on the throne. We have this extraordinary situation where Wallis and Edward is now abdicated. It's 1940, May 1940. The Germans are coming through France. France has capitulated. They head off to Spain, and then eventually to Portugal. During this time, he's a serving major general. What does he do? Through Spanish contacts, he contacts the Germans and asks them, oh, would you mind awfully looking after our villa in the south of France? And would you mind awfully looking after our apartment in Paris? So, and then during the conversations with various Spanish diplomats and American diplomats and others, he articulates his loathing for his own family, his contempt for the king, and also the fact that if Britain was very heavily bombed, it would come to its knees within a matter of weeks. So all this was eagerly listened to by various German envoys sent back to Hitler, and they made a concerted attempt in a operation called Operation Willy, where they tried to kidnap him and Wallis, and then spirit them to a castle in the south of Spain, then eventually put them on the throne when Britain was invaded. And by the way, this was part of a coherent and consistent German policy. They tried to do the same with the Norwegian royal family, with the Dutch royal family, who just got onto a plane and hot-footed to London before the Germans arrived. As for the Norwegian king, Haakon, he was hiding in the forest for weeks, hiding away before he could escape.
Right.
So there was a real policy.
And what bothered me was, as Dunkirk, as the British Expeditionary Force is being pushed to the coast, that the Duke of Windsor is staying in Paris to pick up his jewelry at Cartier.
Well, I mean, he's got his priorities, hasn't he? He's got.
But he didn't go to serve.
He went to serve, but he was very much cold-shouldered, and he went to the south of France.
So do you feel sorrier for him than I do? Do you feel I find that he caused a lot of this.
He brought an awful lot upon himself. You think about it. 1936, he decides to abdicate. Why? So that he can marry Wallis. Even after he abdicates, he's got to wait 6 months before he can marry her. So what should he have done? He should have listened to Churchill. He should have listened to Beaverbrook. What did they say to him? Wait. Sit on your hands. Go through the coronation in May 1937. Once the crown's on your head and you're a crown king, what prime minister is going to take you on when you say Wallis is going to be my morganatic wife? So, as a politician, he was utterly useless. I mean, he really was. He didn't think it through at all. And I think that's where Wallis was so angry with him, so disappointed. So when they eventually married, it was a marriage where they'd both been deceiving each other for a long time, even during the courtship. And that led to disappointment, to bitterness, and a kind of indifference in the end, so that when he died not in the arms of Wallis, but in another woman from Baltimore, a nurse called Julie Chatard.
And so his finances were always a bit murky. How did they live? Why did the French give him that fabulous house on the Bourg de Boulogne? And why did they get money from the royal family? And did they get any civil list money or honorariums?
Well, when he abdicated, he was given £25,000 as a stipend.
Do you own Fort Belvedere? Did he sell that?
That was still retained by the royal family. And then he supplemented his income. He wrote his story. Yeah. The King's Story made over $1 million from that in 1950. And then he knew a lot of very well-connected people from Rancho Mirage. They gave him some very good share tips, and he made an absolute fortune. And then Wallis wrote her book in 1957, and bingo, she hit the jackpot again.
And they did commercials, didn't they, Andrew? Someone said they did commercials.
No, he used to whistle commercials, which used to drive Wallis mad.
So when they die, they have a fortune. All their belongings went to auction for about £50 million or dollars.
I think it was $32 million from memory, and it was that famous auction in New York.
Yeah. What happened to the money?
And the money went to a cancer, was either AIDS or cancer, a very good cause.
And talk about Suzanne Bloom, and then we'll move on to our next book.
Well, Suzanne Bloom was the French, a very dogged lawyer who really fought tooth and nail against the royal family, taking the papers, the objet owned by the Duke of Windsor. And she was a stalwart defender of the Windsors, and without them, Mountbatten, who was effectively the envoy to the royal family, would have snaffled all their best pieces.
Did the Prince of Wales, Prince Charles, want the feather brooch that he made for the Duchess?
Yeah.
And that went to auction.
Yeah, that was
Part of that. So how many facelifts did Wallis have?
Well, she had a lot of operations she had several operations. I don't think she had any facelifts, though, looking at some of the later pictures.
So everyone has a copy of this book. It's a great read. You'll find that it's a full life lived. And I asked you which one did you like better? Which character did you like better?
Well, I like Meghan a lot. I think she's a great asset to the British royal family. I think that Wallis is a fascinating character in her own right because she was a great survivor, and she made history. She was walking history.
So I'm going to ask Andrew to start off our conversation on Meghan on two stories. One story deals with her mother and she at the Hollywood Bowl, and the other story is about her getting ready to meet the Queen for the first time.
Right.
And this is in his own words, Andrew Morton.
Okay. Do you want me to read both of them?
Yes, please.
Okay.
Do you mind?
She tells a story about one night she and her mom went to a concert. As Doria was slowly backing her Volvo out of the parking space, another driver impatiently yelled at her, using the N-word. Meghan flushed, her skin prickling with frustration, feeling as well Doria's pain and rage. Meghan looked at her mother and saw her eyes welling with tears. Meghan whispered the only words she could manage. "It's okay, Mommy." But it wasn't okay. They drove home in silence, blood pounding in Meghan's ears, Doria's fingers gripping the steering wheel tightly.
Tells you sort of a setup for this story.
Okay. So
starting
from there?
Yeah, it's the setup. The setup is...
Well, we call this listen with mother. For centuries, the royal houses of Europe have been defined by bloodline and breeding. In Queen Victoria's day, English princes and princesses could only marry their German counterparts. That changed during World War I, when in 1917, George V not only changed the family name to Windsor, but allowed his offspring to marry English aristocrats. Down the decades, even this edict has been considerably diluted. For the most part, the Queen's brood have married commoners, though not divorced commoners. An Olympic horseman, an equerry, a photographer, the daughter of the royal polo manager, and a public relations executive have all joined the royal family without a title between them. Only Lady Diana Spencer was from a traditionally aristocratic family. And look where that got them. The House of Windsor has been sustained by commoners, not by blue bloods. In fact, the same could be said of most of the royal houses of Europe. Meghan's divorce was no longer a concern, as it had been for the previous American to marry a royal, and neither was her biracial heritage. Is that it?
No, keep going.
Oh, keep going, sorry. Any possible uncertainty about the outcome of this meeting lay not with Meghan, and this is Meghan meeting the Queen, but with the man she wanted to marry. He is the one who has been, if not on trial, then under close scrutiny. If he had come to see Granny a few years earlier, when he had an unenviable reputation as an angry drunk with poor judgment, it would have been doubtful that the Queen would have agreed to him marrying a divorced mixed-raced American actor. It would have been a grim, unhappy confrontation, observed a former senior royal official, just as it was when she had to put her foot down in 1955 over her sister Margaret marrying Group Captain Peter Townsend, who was also divorced. If anything, Harry's transformation over the last few years has, together with the popular union between Prince William and Kate Middleton, secured the future of the monarchy. Harry's impeccable behaviour when representing the Queen abroad and his commitment to the Invictus Games has been shrewdly watched and assessed by the sovereign. As a courtier told me, the Queen trusts her grandsons. She has confidence in them in a way that she'd never had with her eldest son. They've really established themselves as being in touch with the public. William and Harry have star quality, believable and authentic heirs to the monarchy. The final seal of approval came from the Queen's corgis. This normally irascible breed were friendly and welcoming when Meghan entered the Queen's sitting room. As Prince Harry said, somewhat ruefully, "I've spent the last 33 years being barked at. This one walks in, absolutely nothing. They lay at her feet and wag their tails. Very sweet," Meghan later told interviewer Michelle Hussein.
Thank you.
I have to say about dogs, my wife's dog is a Havanese and dislikes me with a huge intensity to the point when I come flying from London, I usually find a small deposit under my study.
Andrew, 2 days ago in the Daily Mail Worldwide, they reprinted part of this book. Your book came out in March. The royal wedding is in April, a month later. So they reprinted a story 2 days ago about their meeting and Meghan's, how she handled it. Would you tell everyone the story, how they met, Dean Street, Soho, to their courtship? Can you take us through this? Because I think it's fascinating and inspiring. It's just such a wonderful love story.
Well, I have to say, I used the phrase that Harry used, and it's so perfect, the stars were aligned. I mean,
love that.
I mean, Meghan was, in her own way, looking for a boyfriend. She was over in London in that June for Wimbledon to promote Ralph Lauren products and clothes, and she was wearing them, being photographed. And a mutual friend said, "You might want to meet Prince Harry on a blind date," as you do. And they met at Soho House in a private room, and he realised as soon as he saw her that he was going to have to up his game, because it's one of those things that she said, that she'd spoken at the United Nations. This wasn't some bimbo. She'd actually addressed the United Nations in front of Hillary Clinton and other dignitaries. And there was a real chemistry there from the word go, because they both believed in giving back, both believed in using their positions. She as an actress on Suits, with her own blog, very successful blog, The Tig, and a very popular Instagram account with millions of followers. He, of course, as a royal prince, was able to use his position to promote various interests. And as she said, that got date number 2 in the books, which was like 24 hours later. So obviously there was a real soul connection there. And the second date was spent, half the date was spent looking through diaries saying, when can we get to Botswana to go on safari together? And it always makes me smile, because Harry had done this before. It was like he'd invited 3 young ladies, girlfriends, to a remote safari camp in Botswana, and Meghan was the 4th. But by the end of that trip, we all know what was going to happen, that they were absolutely united and very much in love. And it's a genuine love story, and it really shows that, they all say that when you're not looking for love, you find it. And I think that's what happened. She was just going through the motions. And if it had been the Harry of a few years before, the Harry, undressing in the Las Vegas hotel suite, the one coming out swinging at photographers, the one wearing Nazi regalia at fancy dress parties, I don't think Meghan would have looked twice. She'd have moved on. But I think
the other part of your book, which I loved, was how Meghan invented herself. She grew up very modestly, split family. She went to a good private school in Los Angeles, goes to Northwestern. Some point along the way, she has a nose job. If you see the pictures in your book, before she transformed herself, you go, my gosh, it's a different person. And then as she comes onto Suits, she ends up, I understand, being a multimillionaire off the success of the 7 seasons. So she has her own money. And then she starts, in your book you describe her going on vacation to the Cyrano Hotel and to the really finest places. And she was upping her game the whole time.
Yeah, she was absolutely upping. As you quite rightly say, she came from a broken home. She bounced between living with her mother and her father. Well, we've all seen the behaviour of her father over the last few months, which hasn't really redounded to his credit, and that's an understatement. And she was very well educated. She went to very good schools in Los Angeles, and she was, very bright. And at the same time, she went down the road that so many thousands of young men and young women have gone down, aspiring to be an actor, and going to endless auditions, getting a line here, a line there. And remember, she was 30 when she got the gig on Suits. I mean, in Hollywood, that's way past pensionable age. And so what she did was think, I'm going to make the best use of it. And so, yeah, Suits was a success, and she realised that, after what's going to happen after Suits. She was an ambitious, driving young woman, in a way, in the best American tradition. Very modern woman, I think, as well.
And I think Harry's ambitious for starting his 2 Invictus Games. So,
with the Invictus Games, I think that was a real change in Harry's character, because he was flying back from Afghanistan on a military jet.
Tell that story, please.
And he was there with 3 very badly injured British soldiers, all wired up to drips and so on, and the coffin of a Danish soldier who'd been killed. And he just thought to himself, I've got to do something with my life. I've got to give something back. Hence the fact that he started the Invictus Games, and which have been, attended by former President Obama and other dignitaries.
So their first outing is at the Invictus Games in Toronto. But how did they keep their courtship secret? Because until the press catches up to them, they had this 6 months grace.
Yeah, I mean, it shows you that when people say, "Oh, they live in a goldfish bowl," well, they don't. I mean, a friend of mine was sat next to Meghan not that long ago in Notting Hill. And he was more interested in the bodyguards and trying to have a glimpse of their guns than what she was saying. And she was just, and nobody wrote about it, nobody knew anything about it. So, Harry was able to slip beneath the radar. But he was, in a way, quite extraordinary. She'd be filming Suits in Toronto, catching a plane, arriving in London, being there for a couple of days, and then flying back. And he would be diverting his schedule so that they could meet. And it showed you that very early on they had a genuine commitment to one another, and it was a very modern, long-distance relationship.
I think the picture we have of Harry, the first real picture, is walking behind his mother's coffin at 14 and doing a 2-mile walk, which I thought was just horrible. And I think that you saw him grow up, and he did the Incentibali, which funds HIV in Africa. How do you compare Meghan to Kate Middleton?
Well, I mean, very different characters. Kate Middleton, English Rose, went to college like Meghan, smart girl, but never really had a career. And the criticism of her before she joined the royal family was that, the phrase was "waity Katie," that she was just waiting for her prince to come along. And she would argue that, well, it was very difficult to get a job because she might just be being appointed because of who she was associated with, as opposed to her own abilities. But and I think the interesting thing as well, is that Catherine and William split up for a short time, and that gave all the doubters, all the critics at Buckingham Palace a chance to say, I think we should put her to one side, sir. Because, and this is what I found fascinating, that when William was dating Catherine, nobody at the palace thought for a living second that they would get married. They just thought that Catherine was a useful friend of William's who had helped him during what's known as a wobble, when he didn't know, he wanted to leave the university and go off and do something else. And all the courtiers used everything they could to make him stay there. And they used Catherine as the fact that, as the bait almost, the fact that, and they never expected for a second that he would keep dating her after college. And so when they split up, it gave all the critics the chance to say, well, she's not really, good enough for you, sir. Difference with Harry and Meghan. There's not a cigarette paper between the two of them that Harry has never done anything being absolutely adoring of Meghan. And that's never allowed any criticism of Meghan to come through. So it's interesting that it's Catherine who's had, in the early days, a more difficult time than Meghan, even though, she's American, divorced, biracial.
Talk about how Harry protected her. I mean, he really went to the press and said that they were picking. Tell that story, Andrew.
Well, as soon as the romance came out in, I think it was November 2016, in the Sunday Express newspaper, there was incredible interest from around the world. And there are all kinds of headlines saying that she grew up in a part of LA that was full of bloodbath murders, gangland killings. I mean, she was from Los Feliz, and she lived in Woodland Hills. Anybody who's been to Woodland Hills will know that. The only baths they've got are baths with gold taps. So there was an awful lot of underlying racism in the coverage. But as an experienced royal writer, you knew the moment that Harry came out with that statement, it was game on. This was the girl for him.
What did he say?
He criticised the media for their position, and he said, "This is our lives. This is not a game." And this has been the big difference, by the way, in the royal family over the last few years. Prince William and Prince Harry have been very quick to run to their lawyers, Harbottle and Lewis, and issue all kinds of injunctions, threats, and other things to newspapers and agencies. You may remember that when Catherine was pictured topless in France,
At David Lindley's house.
Yeah, they were sued. The photographers were sued. So they've been far more aggressive.
They won, and they won.
And they won, yeah. And in the old days, the royal motto used to be never complain, never explain. And that's gone out of the window.
And so take the producer of Suits. Tell about his reaction to all this when he finds out, when Harry shows up in Toronto. How did he handle it? How did Karsh handle it?
Well, the way Karsh handled it is, right, how are we going to write her out? Because he knew that if it's serious, then she's going to have to leave. And it was, as he could tell from the word go, it was serious. So the script writers were very carefully moving the story down. And I think that really, that once she'd married her TV screen heartthrob, then you knew that she was going to be on the outs.
Right, and she in one of the scenes has her in a wedding dress that we all know. But when she closes down her Twitter account and her Instagram in order to assume this new relationship, I thought it was extraordinary for her.
I thought it was wrong, to be honest with you, up to a point. I think that there are various royal princesses in Europe who have got their own Instagram accounts,
yeah,
who keep their own Twitter accounts. And I think that now that Meghan has got her feet under the royal table, shall we say, I think she should open up a Twitter account or a blog, and it might just be a blog about her travels. This fall, she's going to Australia, New Zealand.
She leaves. They leave on Monday. So, they leave on Monday. Yeah. The first world tour.
So it'd be nice to read what it's like from the other side. Remember, folks, Queen Victoria wrote a huge volume about her travels. So it's not unique.
Right. Talk about how in the Crown we hear about the mustaches, and today I look at the staff for the young royals, and my daughter's gotten to know some of them, and rather than a lady in waiting, Meghan has a private assistant, a woman who basically helps her. But the courtiers seem to be much hipper, much better, and smarter than the cast in The Crown that seem to be reacting. They seem to be proactive.
I have to say, my favourite character in the Crown is Sir
Tommy
Alan,
Lascelles.
Tommy Lascelles. Yeah,
Lascelles.
I can watch him endlessly. So I'm afraid I disagree with you about that. I mean, the courtiers were from a different age. And yes, these days the courtiers are different. They could be gay, they could be divorced. I mean, you know, the old days, you didn't have Catholics working for the royal family, you didn't have Jews, you didn't have people of colour. All that's changed. And rightly so, because, you know, you asked me initially about the monarchy, did I believe in the monarchy? I think the monarchy has got a great role as a template, as showing people how things can be and how an organisation can be run. And, you know, when you go to Buckingham Palace, as I know you do, Jamie, every so often, everybody's on their best behaviour,
yes.
and everybody's trying to do the right job.
So, can you take us to, I think, the history? You knew Prince Andrew. You basically broke the story about Prince Andrew dating Sarah Ferguson. So the plight of the second son, it's always been the plight. And yet Harry, I'd like you to comment about how Harry has broken this with this marriage, I think, and his change.
Well, I think that Prince Harry was very lost, very needy. I think he, as he says himself, he was, you know, he needed psychological counselling for the abrupt death of his mother, for everything he's gone through, and you know, and some of the appalling sights he'd seen in Afghanistan. So he has turned his life around thanks to counselling, thanks to, you know,
but look at Andrew,
private conversations.
Andrew, who had a silver platter and basically led an inconsequential life compared to what Harry's doing.
Well, this is the point I'm coming on to. That Harry has really learnt from his mistakes and is moving forwards with the Invictus Games and the other things that he does. And I think that the phrase "the Fab Four" is very well said, because, you know, like the Beatles, these four will keep the monarchy going well into the next century. As for Prince Andrew, he was in a perfect position to influence things around the world. He was the most celebrated bachelor of his day. The marriage to Sarah Ferguson was seen as, you know, riotous and fun, and that the couple would be an interesting foil for Prince Charles and Princess Diana. Didn't happen like that, did it? It just he stayed with the Navy. She was having dalliances with Texan accountants who were sucking her toes.
Mr. Bryant.
And as a financial advisor, he was probably telling her what goes up also comes down. But it was an extraordinary episode in the royal family, and I don't think Prince Andrew's ever recovered from that. And yet they seem to be great friends and living together.
Right. So your book ends before the wedding. We now have the royal wedding, which I thought was brilliant and perfection. Prince Charles told me he was the one who discovered the choir, that they were in South London, and he recommended it. Harry picked the song "Stand By Me," which is written by a person who lives here.
And it was also arranged by Mike Stoller. Mike Stoller, just the fact that you'll never know anywhere else in the world, he lives just around the corner from where Meghan and her first husband, Trevor Engelson, lived in Hollywood Hills.
Exactly.
There you are.
We had dinner with him. But tell us about the Queen taking the Duchess of Sussex on a royal tour by herself. She never did that with Kate Middleton. And
she never did that with Diana either. I mean, I think that this is the point I'd like to make, is that with Diana, you may remember, they basically left her to her own devices, and she had to basically learn on the job. And her first job was going to Wales in the pouring rain whilst pregnant. Not a good start, and she was sobbing her eyes out. Meghan, as an actress, used to performing before an audience, but even so, it's a different kind of audience. She's used to red carpets in Hollywood, but in Britain, when you do a walkabout, there's no red carpets. It's usually grey and raining. So it's a kind of a different place. But the Queen, I think, has shepherded these four people, William, Harry, Catherine and Meghan, in a way that they are the stars of the future. And yes, of course, Prince Charles will be the next king, and everything's been... it's not a beauty contest. You just get the job.
Andrew, do you think the Queen would ever abdicate?
Are you mad? No.
I was asking.
She's the same age as my mother, and hopefully, like my mother, she'll just keep on going.
Thank you. So, Andrew, tell us about living in America as opposed to between London and Pasadena. What are the differences between Pasadena and London? Things that you like and things that you don't like.
Well, I mean, obviously the big difference between Pasadena and sunny London is that your weather's terrible.
Are you driving on the American side?
Am I what, sir?
Do you drive on the American side?
I drive on the American side, yeah, in America.
Do you see yourself becoming an American citizen?
I'm a green card holder, but your tax rates are way too high.
My daughter says about living in London, she has to come back to America to save taxes. So tell us about Brexit. What was your position on Brexit and the US-UK special relationship with the Prime Minister and the President?
Well, I mean, I better choose my words with care, hadn't I? Domestically, I went to bed at 11 o'clock at night thinking, yes, we're going to stay in the EU. Woke up in the morning, felt sick because we'd decided to come out. I blame David Cameron for this because there should have been a more structured vote whereby you had to have a bigger majority, like 66%, as you normally do with any financial vote in a major company. And I think that this has been a disaster for Britain at a time when Britain's influence and needs to be focused on the wider world, given what's going on in Europe and the Middle East.
And what about the
special relationship? Well, the special relationship has been sometimes it's been very special, sometimes not so special. I don't think at the minute having the Queen carrying Donald Trump's golf clubs is a good use of the special relationship.
Have you ever heard the expression?
Did you not see her carrying the clubs at Windsor Castle for him?
I
mean, it was not fair, I didn't think.
Have you ever heard the expression arrow golf at Balmoral? What is it?
Yes, this is during my research for my book on Wallis, I got some old film, and the film showed the only time that Edward VIII had a house party at Balmoral. And they were playing a game called arrow golf, where you had a stick and a piece of string, and you hurl this kind of ball into the distance. And you see Mountbatten, the king, his brother George, and Wallis was fussing around. It was an extraordinary film in the sense that Wallis comes alive when she's smiling and moving. And because when you look at pictures of her, she's quite got quite a flat face, but she really comes alive, and her face is frothy, she's bubbling, and she looks very, very fun. And the irony is, this weekend was one where she didn't want to come. She'd written to the king saying, doing effectively the equivalent to a Dear John letter, saying, "This is me, not you. I think we should call the whole thing off." And he'd threatened to shoot himself if she didn't come to Balmoral. She would only go to Balmoral if she was accompanied by two American friends, Herman and Catherine Rogers, who lived in Upper New York State. And so she then, with that pressure on her, comes to Balmoral, and she's the life and soul. And the only fly in the ointment is when the Duchess of York, later the Queen Mother, walks in, totally ignores Wallis and says, "I'm just here to see the King." And and yet she still smiles, and even despite that being very rude. But it was a very interesting film and a very interesting weekend.
Well, I want to thank you, Andrew, on behalf of Rancho Mirage. I hope you have a warm welcome here. We hope you'll come back for the Writers' Festival, and thank you.
Thank you very much.